Today we're diving deep into the Trump dynasty, and we're going to be seeing how over the ages, over the last 2,000 years, whoa, cards everywhere, the different religious groups were involved in politics because Socrates and everyone belonged to a different class before the Romans came in, essentially, and had the birth of Christ and the new belief system in which the Jews and the Gentiles from the Old Testament essentially were fighting with the new Christians, and of course they were extremely under persecution. So let's begin with this deep dive reading. I'm going to do a 3-part series, and we're going to look at the different phases here of the Trump dynasty and how we as a world, planet Earth, set up our situation, because essentially what I'm saying is that, you know, there's a saying with this situation in the presidency of America right now, which is that all roads lead to Putin. But the truth is, the original phrase was all roads lead to Rome. And so the first card we get is the lady up, the Empress. Well, on our reading, all the cards do lead to the Empress. She is the highest order of female ruler. Okay, and she was reversed, okay? So we'll come back to her. So this is in the time of Christ. We're talking about the takeover of Rome, the Jews and the Gentiles, and here's the 6 of moons, by the way. This corresponds to the phases of the moon and the cycles of the earth. So this is the forces of nature when the Christians came in at Avalon and took over the females. Okay, so in the old days, what this is saying is that the powers were held by the woman, the spiritual powers. Okay, and now, as you can see, at 2000 AD, we have the 6 of Sons. So what happens is the ruling class comes in, and that's the Roman invasion. And of course, at that time, we have reversed judgment, which meant that, gosh, you know, this was essentially the birth of Christ in our reading here. So that's interesting that we're getting this card, the judgment in reverse. Now, after Christ, of course, we have the beginning of the papacy, and so I knew I was going to find the papal cards here because that's what our reading is. Amazing how that works. And so we see that the conquering of the female economical power is overtaken by the figure of the male, except that we have the class now of the Pope. And once again, in the year, I believe it was 7th century AD, we had the only female pope. So this is not the pope, this is the popess, and she was the only woman pope, Pope Joan. So now we're talking 600 AD. So this actually signifies the imposter syndrome, because when she was found to be a woman, she was, of course, we don't want to know what happened to her. And so at this time in our world, there was a huge belief system, because the flat earth was the ruling belief, and now we were changing to science, and the fact that science and astrology, this was a very important time, because in Rome, in the Vatican, Aristotle had a huge nave, and he kept all the main astrology, and the astronomy was what started all of that. But at that time, the popes were not divorced from the astrologer, and there was a class of cardinals who were in the church. And so what happened was, at that time, and this is the Ten of Sons, the establishment of the monarchy became. So the Pope then would align with the king, and the power of the king was gained from God. And you'll remember, like, learning about Britain and the House of Windsor, and you know that the coronation of the king, they always say, God save the king, because God coronates the king. So this is the coronation, okay? And there at that time still was the church and the state. So we're talking about the alignment of church and state in around 1000 AD. And at this point, we have a class of cardinals, and this is the class of stars. So the Pope of Rome and the Vatican actually ruled. Like in 13th century Europe, they were above the king. And if you were not aligned with Rome, you were essentially a heretical, and thus they came and conquered in the name of God, because they believed that everyone who wasn't the suit of stars, which is the Vatican, ruled over the monarchy. And now we have modern day, and at the beginning, we had the pregnancy. Oh God, I knew this was going to come up. This is Our Lady. She is the Queen of, this is the Queen of Suns in the Roger Waite deck. She is the pregnant woman. So what this is saying is we're having the birth of a new nation, the idea of a republic and the separation of church and state. Many, many countries had to fight for. Even in as late as the 19th century, there are many monarchies which were overthrown in Europe and taken over with mostly parliamentary government. So what this is saying is that the Queen of Suns, or the Lady of Suns, which would be the Queen of Wands, is pregnant with the birth of the Republic. And so this now brings us up to the 18th century, 1776, the birth of the United States and the Republic. And now we have the Nine of Suns again. But once again, we see that the separation of the church and state is once again rejoining, because the fight between the evangelicals and the Supreme Court is no longer separate from the idea of the Christians voting in terms of a republic. And so what this is saying is now the flock, which are identified as the supporters who identify themselves as evangelical, are his followers, and the king, okay, the monarchical class, which is of course going to be a sun class, is their ruler. Now, in a good way, he is there to protect them. But in this instance, we have an obstruction, which is the reverse of the Four of Spheres. Oh man, I hate to say it, but this is my Bernie Sanders card. Oh, wow. And you know that it's going to be by this, which is in the one position, which is the reversed Empress. So right now, what this is saying is the op-eds, and don't believe it, and I had to say this in the news, is that the op-eds all say that both MSNBC and Fox News, the main channels, are being infiltrated by Russia. And our final card is a reverse of fortitude. This is strength, but what this means is weakness. And so the Empress, who's standing in her weak aspect, which is, I hate to say it, but it's actually gossip. Okay, that's what's considered fake news or gossip online or social media right now. It's they're op-eds. Okay, these are Russian op-eds. Okay, example of a Russian op-ed. Bernie Sanders, Barr resigns. That was a Russian op-ed. Everyone fell for it. It was like, this is fake news being fed over MSNBC and any news channel. So in the weakness of our, loss of strength to protect the people, this is the people, this is the man who stands for the people. This is my Bernie Sanders card. He has the underground. See that? Those are little moles. See that? They're little moles, and he's feeding them, and these are the underground, okay? So in our weakness and our failure to protect Bernie, the gossip from the Empress, which is Rome, okay? Rome being ruled by an imposter pope who is giving orders to the queen of the monarchs. I would say that this is more of a Putin card in this case even, but this is the birth of the republic. Now, you know that Putin recently ousted part of his cabinet or something. I forget. Like the guy resigned. Like they kind of have a fake parliament now. And in the end, the people's weakness is the lack of strength to view the information. All right. Thank you to all the new subscribers. Thank you for the likes. It's a little reminder for entertainment.